All right, let's get it over with.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
As a law, if you have a video on the Spanish Inquisition, you have to play that video. But that's it. No more. Okay, one more.
The Inquisition. Let's begin. The Inquisition.
Look out, Sam.
We have a mission to convert the Jews.
Jew.
By the time the institution was finished in 1834, roughly 3,000 to 5,000 people had not expected the Spanish Inquisition. Some 100 to 150,000, though, were prosecuted, held for trial, sometimes months, sometimes years. And of that number, 3,000 to 5,000 were executed. But here's the problem with the Inquisition. We get it mixed up with the Middle Ages and the general Inquisition itself. We hear all kinds of garbled, exaggerated claims about Iron Maidens, torture racks. A lot of things kind of have grown with the telling, so that even the people already read as villains for you. Maybe you've heard of the name Torquemada.
Let's face it, you can't talk him out of anything.
And he's supposed to be like a Voldemort, whose name is only whispered in dark corners. The reason for all this is there is something called the Black Legend, which is several hundred years of Protestant and anti-Spanish propaganda that has churned the Spanish Inquisition into kind of a cartoon version of itself. And on the other hand, you have what I call the White Legend, which is everything here is just a few regrettable excesses by otherwise reasonable men. But historians have actually spent a better part of a century unpacking fact from fiction, and I want to tell you that story. Because deep down beneath the legends, in the actual documents, in the trial records, the account books, the edicts of the inquisitors themselves, you go there, you'll find the actual story, the actual history of the Spanish Inquisition. And what I want to say is that the actual story is different than either the Black Legend or the White Legend will lead you to believe. Because the story, though more tame than you might have expected, only 3,000 to 5,000 burned, the real story is worse because the Spanish Inquisition is not part of the Dark Ages. It's not part of a medieval exercise. It's actually a modern, bureaucratic institution. It kept meticulous records. It ran a formal procedure. It had an appellate court and even a Supreme Court to review all sentences. And its torture sessions were monitored by physicians with a notary present at all times, writing down every word. That is, as I'm going to say, far different than anything you're going to find in really even other countries in Europe at the time. But let me tell you that story. February 6, 1481, in a public square in the city of Seville, 6 people, men and women, known as Conversos, baptized Christians, are led to the stake and burned alive. They are convicted of secretly practicing the Judaism that they had been pressured to abandon. And this is the first time the new tribunal sends human beings to the stake, and the machine that will run for 3.5 centuries has just had its first public execution. And that is typically where the story of the Spanish Inquisition starts, with this execution right here. But, as all things happen, there are antecedents, there are precursors. So let me set the stage for you so you understand why this happened and what people, places, and things are in place that make this execution a reality. First, to understand the Inquisition, you have to understand the world that it grew out of, because that world looks nothing like the Spain you're probably picturing in your own mind. Start with the map. In the Middle Ages, there is no single country called Spain, even though I and other historians will use that word when referring to this patchwork of kingdoms. The Iberian Peninsula is just that. It's a patchwork of rival Christian kingdoms, chiefly Castile and Aragon, each with its own king and its own law. And in those kingdoms, you can have infighting, so it can be a hot mess pretty quick. And for centuries, much of the peninsula isn't even Christian at all. I have other videos on this, the Merovingians and Charlemagne videos, very old by now. But I lay out some of this. But to summarize, in the year 711, Muslim armies crossed from North Africa and conquered the bulk of the Iberian Peninsula. So for hundreds of years, some of the most sophisticated cities in Europe, places like Cordoba, Toledo, Granada, are Muslim cities under Muslim rule. The Christian kingdoms are always up in the north. Therefore, by the time you get to this execution, The Iberian Peninsula has been, by and large, a peninsula of three peoples: Christians, Jews, and Muslims. But importantly, throughout most of the Middle Ages, those Christian kingdoms waged a war of what we know today as the Reconquista, or the reconquering and the retaking of many of these lands back under Christian rule. But it's important to realize that every time a Christian kingdom conquers a stretch of Muslim land, it did not empty it. It inherited everything that was already there: Jewish merchants and physicians and financiers, Muslim farmers and all types of artisans and thinkers. The whole working population is a very sophisticated society, so just because a Christian king is conquered means that he generally ends up ruling a large community of Christians and Jews and Muslims. And for most of 200 years, from the 12th and the 13th centuries, the answer was deeply pragmatic. Because you need them. It even has a name: convivencia, the living together. And I want to be precise about this because this is not, to your modern ears, what you might think it is. This is not equality. Hollywood loves to kind of play up this idea that at some point in the Middle Ages, Jews, Christians, and Muslims were super friendly. Maybe in pockets here and there, but it's not a vibe, let's put it that way. But here, you have some version of equality that would pass by the Middle Ages standards. Christians, in this case, are always on top, but it's not some idea of pluralism. It's just that the religious minorities had legal protections, clear economic rules that they could and could not play, and often room or space to live by themselves. And it wasn't always in the cities. It included the country as well, countryside. So as I said, the Reconquista is a centuries-long campaign by Christians to try to retake back this land. It's very simple to remember: from 700 to 1492, a very important date. You might remember it. But when you have a war that takes that long, something very interesting happens. Despite the fanaticism of the war, the results of this type of Reconquista war are always practical because fanaticism is impossible. This is a struggle that spans generations, and you end up needing every hand you can get. Christians, as they continue to conquer the Iberian Peninsula, frequently do not have the luxury of purity. You need Jewish financiers, Muslim farmers, and anyone who can help the frontier kingdom continue to expand southward. You can actually see this when it happens. 1085, Alfonso VI of Castile, he actually takes the city of Toledo. This is the old Visigothic capital, and it had become a real jewel in Muslim Spain's crown, one of the great cities of the medieval world. And when Alfonso takes it, he does something that would have been considered crazy to a crusader from the north. He doesn't purge the city. He doesn't force conversions. He actually styles himself the emperor of two religions, the Jews and the Muslims. And you have to understand, this isn't a polite fiction. In this case, Jews served as soldiers in the Castilian armies. In fact, Jewish physicians became prized things by kings. In fact, it became prized by all wealthy folks, all noble folks in this day. If you could say that you had a Jewish physician, it was just considered a badge of honor, a badge of pride. You had made it. Jews and Muslims do all kinds of things in the royal courts. Translation work, intellectual work. It's still done in the teeth of oppression. But I have to make this clear that this is not the same type of Jewish segregation you see often in Northern Europe in the same Middle Ages. It's different. But I want to say again, in almost every case where a Christian king is conquering these lands, they end up settling with the locals that are Jews and Muslims. They create protected rights. They have things like the Jews only pay taxes directly to the king or queen, not to the local municipalities. Often the Jews will be exempt from having to do anything locally, Muslims as well. In fact, to the eyes of most of Europe, and historians are quick to point this out, every time folks from the West travel through Spain, say on the way to a crusade or merchants, this type of stuff, you often get this reverberation where they'll complain about how free-flowing the society is in Spain. And it is during this time, the 14th century, big century, Black Death, Joan of Arc, Peasants' War in England, 100 Years' War, and throughout Europe, you have a new rise of some different ideas within the church that in the early 1300s begin to shift things away from tolerance with the Jews and Muslims in European contexts. The Big Council, the Council of Vienna, met from 1311 to 1312. It is one of the greatest councils in the Western Church. It's presided over by Clement V, and it's the one that dissolves the Knights Templar. I need to do a video on them at some point, but not yet. But this is that time. And Spanish bishops go up and attend this council where a lot of discussion is being had about the infection of foreign influence in Europe, particularly by Jews. In very simple terms, Northern Europe began to segregate and degenerate its relationship with Jewish folks, and they began to do this within church councils. Back in Spain, though this was not the norm, society had basically built itself around some sense of professional equality, not religious equality or ethnic equality, but a certain amount of professional live and let liveness was going on in Spain. Well, what a lot of historians have pointed out is that as Europe begins to rise in its anti-Semitism in the 14th century, this comes down into Spain as well. I won't spend a long time elaborating all of these decisions, all of these little councils and meetings, but it's a trickle at first. Jews were to be enclosed in a quarters, walled in an area called the Aljamas. They are barred from medicine, surgery, shopkeeping, not allowed to trim their beards or cut their hair. They're supposed to wear long cloaks and red badges over their hearts to mark themselves as Jewish. Now, these are the legislations that are passed on the books, in councils, in meetings, by the Catholic Church in Spain. There's no getting around that. What historians have pointed out, though, is that by and large, most of these regulations were not enforced. Again, most of the Jewish and, by extension, Muslim folks within the Iberian Peninsula had integrated themselves and gotten very good at knowing what lines were crossable and which lines were not. So the Spanish kings never really felt this need to go to war with the Jews themselves. They never felt there was a big problem. This is trickling in, though, bit by bit, through the Catholic Church making certain council decisions in favor of Jewish segregation and demarcation. What's interesting is that none of this is a pogrom. This is a piece of legislation that trickle by trickle puts on the books all of these regulations, and then, as I've said, many of these in the local communities do not get even enforced themselves. But the church, and by extension the crowd, begin to build up an intolerant system brick by brick. And then after a while, that legislation, it can eventually appear as if Spain has simply always been that way. It, in fact, had not. Spain actually ironically held out against this kind of organized anti-Semitism longer than anyone else in Western Christendom. The Reconquista made Islam the main focus for Christian kings in Spain, not the Jewish folks who happened to be lending them money to finance that war. But in the end, the legislation and the fire and the heat eventually did light a powder keg. And that powder keg was 1391. Okay, first of all, the locations. As I've mentioned, many of these areas, north to south, were taken by the Reconquista, and they're old Muslim capitals, and they are jewels, running water, medicine, mathematics, stuff that's generations ahead of anything happening in Paris or London. Its economy runs on the thing that most of Europe at this point is killing and running off, which is Jewish financiers lending with interest, as well as physicians and tax collectors, as I said. Muslims corner the market in farming and engineering and other things like silk weaving, decidedly intermingled in terms of the economics here. The two big figures at the head of the political spear here are Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile. Two names, Ferdinand and Isabel. The two crowns that joined these two kingdoms together by one marriage. They who sent Columbus over the sea, they who finished the Reconquista, and here, they who oversaw the Spanish Inquisition. But it's important to realize that by the beginning of the Inquisition itself, much of the problem that the Inquisition seeks to address was its own doing. Because the hinge of all of this is not in 1492, but it's actually in 1391, with the invention of the Conversos. Rarely in history is one person, one event the thing that kind of triggers everything, but in this case, it is closer to that than not. The man in question is Ferran Martinez. He's the Archdeacon of Asia, which makes him a middle-rank official of the church in the area of Seville. He spends more than a decade preaching that the killing of Jews would be a service to God. He started to preach this around 1378, and the king orders him to stop. The archbishop orders him to stop. Even at some point, the pope jumps in and orders that he stop making this case, making these sermons, and Ferran ignores all of them. He keeps on preaching, telling crowds that Jewish blood on Christian hands is a figment. It's not a real problem. And not just that, but that God required that the Aljamas, the Jewish ghettos, should be razed to the ground. In the summer of 1391, the regency of the crown collapsed, Henry III of Castile is at this point just a child. I've often said whenever you have a child on the throne, you have big nightmares. In this case, the nobles begin to fight amongst themselves, and there is no functioning royal authority, no really hand strong enough to hold the till, and Ferran Martinez seizes the opportunity. Early in June 1391, through his preaching, Seville erupts. A mob storms the Jewish quarter, and by the traditional count, some 4,000 Jews are killed during this uprising. The rest, those who survive, are dragged to the baptismal font at sword point. They are told to convert or die. Those are the options. All the synagogues are seized and consecrated as churches. That fire then begins to spread as these things happen, like a contagion. Valencia in July, again, the community is destroyed and the survivors are forced to be baptized. Then Toledo, then Barcelona, which was one of the largest and most prosperous Jewish communities in Europe at the time, gone in a matter of days. Palma, Girona, Lleida, city after city. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 50,000 people die across Spain during this time. Over 100,000 people are forcibly baptized in the Crown of Aragon alone. Some of that data, some of those numbers is in doubt. Historians love to argue about that, but the scale is accurate. That's about how many we're talking. Now, the reason we're bringing this up is these 1391 massacres created the problem that is going to lead to the Spanish Inquisition. Because prior to 1391, as I've said, Spain had some legal way of understanding tolerance. But now what have you done in 1391? You've just brought hundreds of thousands of Jews and forced converted them. And you created a new class, a new title, the Conversos, who are the new Christians. And that's what you'll often see them described as in historical literature, historical writings. They're the new Christians. And what's going to get set up here is a fight between the new Christians and the so-called old Christians who were there all along. And this creates a situation where you have the old Christians who start to treat the new Christians as if they're mudbloods. And it becomes an issue of blood guilt, blood libel, that carries on though one is now a baptized Christian. It's a giant mess. Why? Because Jews prior to 1391 had actually been legally protected, though they were boxed in. Yeah, they couldn't hold public office, they couldn't marry Christians, and they couldn't enter the church hierarchy as ordained folks, of course. They were contained, invisible, and very identifiable, though obviously oppressed. But conversos are baptized Christians. You just forced a bunch of people who did not choose to do so to become baptized Christians, which means what? They can now be ordained, they become priests, they can marry your daughters, they can attend university, they can do anything they want. And they do. And this is an important piece of the Spanish Inquisition because often you get this idea that hundreds of thousands are forced converted. Terrible to imagine. But by the account of the day, by Jewish rabbis in particular, plenty of Jews took this option and were like, fine, we're totally happy with this. And this is why. You're like, wait, why would they willingly convert? Well, the rabbis complained that they were just sort of what we would today call lukewarm, that they weren't really Jewish in a religious sense, or another way of saying it is the Jews in Spain, some of them had come to see their Jewish identity as an ethnic identity, a historic identity, not part of their actual lived religious experience, right? So when this opportunity of baptism comes up, they're like, yeah, sign me up. I'll baptize right now. And now all of the opportunities of life are available to them. And now the church doesn't like it. So, because within a generation, conversos rise up to the commanding heights of Spanish life. They become immediately disproportionately represented among the educated, the administrators, the financiers, the high clergy. They carry the commercial networks. Again, they're already in finance. They even become bishops, royal counselors. Yep, and old Christians are furious. The resentment in this case is actually visceral. And it's important to slow down and sit with that. Because according to the conversos, they had done everything that was asked of them. Everything demanded. They had walked to the baptismal fount, or maybe their grandfather did after a while, in 1391. And then here we are generations later, and they're attending church and getting on in society. Now, yes, the next question is, were there recusant Jewish folks throughout all of Spain? Yes, of course. There are folks that keep their Jewish heritage hidden under lock and key. There are folks that refuse. There are folks that flee. There are folks that attempt to get down to the continent of Africa. They're immediately robbed and beaten, and they flee back and then convert the second time when they're forced to realize they have nowhere else to go. It's a lot of complexity in terms of how the Jewish population receives the 1391 demand. But very quickly, those who didn't really care religiously about being Jewish, those who just wanted peace and prosperity, adapt very quickly. But, as I've said, Spain now has a problem for itself. They have a class of people who are Christian by sacrament and suspicious by blood. I'm going to say that again because that's the most important part. You have a class of people after 1391 in Spain that are Christian by baptism, but are now suspicious because of their blood. Were they really converted? People begin to ask. Are they secretly Jewish? Sort of play acting as Christians during the day and lighting Sabbath candles at night. The problem, of course, as I said, is the issue is unresolved. It's too complex. There's too many variables, too many different types of folks. Like I said, there are folks that will take the bait, go baptism all the way, leave their Jewish roots behind instantly. There are those who fight it, and everything in between. It's a spectrum of engagement. But after 1391, they have an increased problem of conversos rising up in power and authority. There are little attempts to slow this down. Toledo, the city I mentioned before, 1449, actually passes a purity of blood clause. And you have to realize theologically just how cruel this ends up being, because the entire Christian claim is that baptism erases everything that came before it. There is no Jew or Greek, straight out of Galatians. Baptism is supposed to be the universal solvent. So in the end, after 1391, this is what the Inquisition is. The Inquisition is not a witch hunt, it's not going after Muslims on their own, and it's not going after Jewish people on their own. It's going after only conversos. Those folks who were forced to be baptized, who are now identifying as Catholic Christians, who may, and this is important, have come to adopt and embrace that faith, now being excluded from things based on the substance of their blood. So it is in that world that the Inquisition steps. It's not Judaism itself, it's conversos. The Inquisition actually has no jurisdiction over practicing Jews. It doesn't. The Inquisition is a church matter, and it only deals with those who are baptized Christians. So you have this weird Frankenstein of anti-Jewish Inquisition going after baptized Christians who happen to be Jewish, or in this case, were forced to be Jewish and never wanted to be Christian in the first place. You can see why this is a problem. To put it very simply, baptism was supposed to be the door to acceptance. Instead, it became a cage for the Jewish folks who are now called themselves Christian. And that cage lasts for about 350 years. Okay, first things first. Often when people say the Inquisition, they blur two different institutions together. There was a medieval Inquisition, founded in the 1230s. And that Inquisition, of course, was part of the church, and it focused on folks like the Cathars in southern France. That Inquisition was more episodic, very decentralized. It answered directly to Rome. No, the Spanish Inquisition borrowed that name, Inquisition, and some of its procedures, but it is a different animal entirely. It is permanent, centralized, and, underscore this, it is royal. It is not part of the church. That's the important thing. What Spain builds in 1478 is not a throwback to the 13th century. It is something newer, and in some ways, it is something more frightening. Now, the part of the spark that gets this going is, again, another preacher. Back in 1477, Queen Isabella came to Seville, and she stays there about 14-15 months, and she comes out of the preaching of another Dominican, a prior this time named Alfonso de Ojeda, who has made the conversos his singular obsession. He preaches constantly in front of Isabella that the city is honeycombed with all of these secret Jews that are there to pervert and corrupt the church. And here the historians are unanimous. And I don't get to say that very often, so I will say it here. Historians are unanimous. Ojeda's preaching is one of the most immediate triggers of everything that happens after. First step, they issue a new catechism in the hopes of teaching the conversos to be better Christians. And the crown takes that option first. Within months, a report arrives to Ferdinand and Isabella that the conversos are in fact Judaizing in secret across Andalusia and Castile. They believe it, and they send that on to Rome and ask for help. In 1478, Pope Sixtus IV issues the bull granting Ferdinand and Isabella the authority to appoint inquisitors in Castile. This is the founding document, and it's very critical in understanding its structure. Because unlike the medieval papal Inquisition, which answered to Rome, the Spanish Inquisition in this document answers to the crown. Ferdinand and Isabella control all of the appointments. The crown receives any and all confiscated revenue. The Pope grants a certain theological authority, of course, but the crown holds all the keys. That's important. The Spanish Inquisition is a royal instrument from its very inception. Very quickly, the Pope actually tries to take the keys back. In 1482, Sixtus IV actually began to hear complaints that the new Castilian tribunals were actually seizing people based on rumor alone. They were brushing past the normal procedures of canon law, and that they were confiscating with abandon. So he actually issues a brief trying to rein them in. He argues that all appeals run to Rome directly, and he argues, as I'll say in a second, that the accused ought to be told what their charges are. That's an important thing. And that the bishops ought to share some control in the matters. Ferdinand writes back and essentially says, screw you, no. He is all but astonished that the Pope would even ask this. And the Pope backs down. And that's one of the more important things to understand about the Spanish Inquisition is that it does not answer to the Pope, it answers to the crown. This is a state, a political state, taking on religious instruments and making it their own to achieve their own ends. The first inquisitors arrive in Seville by 1480. By February 1481, they are already burning people. The early years are the savage years. The half century from 1480 to roughly 1530, that's where most people stop, accounts for the great majority of all the executions the Inquisition would ever carry out. It's important to know, though, that most of the lament in the story about the Spanish Inquisition and its role on the Jewish community gets this part wrong because it leaves out the 1391 piece. This is not a Jewish community in its own ghetto being attacked in ways that you're used to seeing in Europe throughout history. Rather, this is people that have converted, are part of the establishment, and are getting picked off left and right. Bishops, priests, your neighbor, your cousin Eddie, all kinds of folks are just getting rounded up and questioned because of their blood, not because of the content of their faith. As you can imagine, all kinds of opportunity for abuse. You owe your business partner money, and is he Jewish? You want to get out of that debt? You know, I saw him eating some brisket the other day, and he turned him in. So by this time, 1480 to 1530, those that are eligible to flee are much smaller in number. The devastation has already happened. Those who stay face the Edict of Faith, the auto da fe. And this is one of the more important pieces of the Spanish Inquisition. It's a famous phrase, a famous moment, series of moments, I should say. In the early days of the Inquisition, there was something called the Edict of Grace, and it was this window of time, usually about 30, 40 days, in which the Conversos could come forward, confess on their own, and be reconciled with light penalty, some penance, maybe a fine, and no confiscation. That was seen often as the carrot. What replaced it was the auto da fe, and that is very much the stick. Every year in every parish in Spain, a document is read aloud from the pulpit. It commanded all Christians, under pain of excommunication, to denounce anyone showing signs of heresy within a set number of days. It provided a checklist as to what to look for. Does your neighbor change into clean linens on Saturday? Do they avoid pork? Do they name their children with Old Testament names? Do they turn the face of a dying man to the wall? And do they bless their children by laying their hands on their head versus making the sign of the cross? It's actually a longer list than that. It's very specific. You have a few days to report, and if you know someone and you stay silent, you too are excommunicated. This is the entire mechanism in its simplicity. Now, there are varieties to this. Some of it's more severe, some of it's less severe. It's multiple hundreds of years. I'm just trying to summarize it so you can understand the process and see, according to our modern ears and eyes, the things that we find so crazy about this legal system. You can accuse anyone of anything: personal grudge, business rivalry, revenge. Now, that system was codified, written down by Thomas de Torquemada. He is the name that everyone knows. And he outlined this in 1484 in his instructions. And the structure he gives is very sort of crystal-like. There's the Suprema, which is the Supreme Council of the Inquisition, and it sits at the center, and it oversees a network of regional tribunals across Spain. And eventually, by the way, it goes on. It carries on into Sicily, Sardinia, and other places, even to the Americas. And each tribunal has 2 inquisitors, a prosecutor, a secretary, theological advisors, and a local network of familiares, unsalaried lay agents who served as the inquisitor's eyes and ears in every town, sort of deputized informants. The other big thing is the money, the confiscation. This is often talked about. Confiscation was always retroactive. When you're convicted of heresy, the Inquisition seizes everything you own. It even reaches back to everything you've ever owned, tracing back to your first date of heresy. This could be decades before your arrest. If you sold a house 15 years ago, the sale could be voided. If you have creditors, they can be denied. If you have children, they can inherit nothing. And the informers are rewarded out of the scale of the money confiscated. Now, it's important to realize that much of this is not a fabulously rich engine that's just sort of gorging on confiscated lucre. The account books bear this out pretty explicitly. Once the wealthy conversos were bled out, the money largely went with them. You weren't going to get new conversos, new Jewish folks, gaining lots of wealth and then having it pillaged out through this process. This wasn't, in other words, a money grab. This was like a theological, political, ethnic, religious spasm all happening at once. And as I've said, it's not as if the Inquisition was winning a lot of favors. There has often been this speculation that the tide could have turned against Ferdinand and Isabella for doing this. That was until 1485, September 15th, when a group of conversos, when they murdered the Inquisitor Pedro de Arbues in the Cathedral of Zaragoza. He was kneeling down to pray at the altar, and they snuck up behind him and they stabbed him. Just when, again, there could have been a churn away from this bloodletting. Now the conversos definitely showed their hand, or at least that's what the allegations pinned on them. Ferdinand seized on this. Arbues becomes a martyr, eventually a saint. The people of Aragon, who had been hostile to the new tribunal, are now themselves horrified by the assassination, and the opinion swings very hard in the opposite direction. Finally, in 1492, the same year Columbus reaches the Americas, Ferdinand and Isabella expel all practicing Jews from Spain. And this is the Alhambra decree. Estimates are anywhere from 40 to 200,000 folks were expelled from Spain as a whole. So now, with the Jews themselves gone, the Inquisition was left only with the task of taking on the Conversos and cleansing the Catholic Church finally of the Jewish blood. Okay, so what was it like? What was the actual machinery of the Inquisition like? What was it like if you got arrested? Well, it always happens at night. You get a knock at the door, and the armed familiares are there, and you are taken. Even before you've reached the prison, the sequestration has begun. Officials are in your home, cataloging every piece of furniture, every garment, every coin, every pot and spoon. Your family is told they'll receive some amount of money as maintenance. You enter a secret prison. And one thing to know is that the dungeons, so to speak, the prisons for the Inquisition, top-notch, high-class, the cleanest, most effective dungeons of the day. The Inquisition actually prided itself on the quality of its prisons. They were not cells or pits. You had windows, but they were barred, of course. You were forbidden writing materials, and you couldn't contact the outside world, so you couldn't make any contact with your family, and you cannot receive the sacrament. But more importantly, you do not know what you're charged with. You don't know who accused you. You don't know how long you'll be there. Some wait years. One, at least, waited decades. After a while, you receive the first monition. The Inquisitor comes to visit. You are urged in that first meeting to confess. Confess what? You don't know because you haven't heard the charges. And that is exactly the point. The system wants you to confess everything, including what the tribunal doesn't yet know. If you confess fully, and your confession matches the accusation, you might get a lighter sentence, some kind of reconciliation or penance, maybe a fine. If you confess partly, and they have more than you've admitted, it's worse. If you confess nothing, it's worse still. So in total, you receive 3 monitions, 3 meetings, and then you get the formal accusation. You finally, at this last meeting, hear the charges, but you still do not know the name of who brought them. You must respond on the spot. You are allowed defense counsel, but it's an advocate who is appointed by the tribunal itself, and the counsel has to consult with you in the presence of the inquisitor. There is no meeting in private. And your counsel cannot even see the full file. Any defense witnesses that you propose can be thrown out as being biased. And finally, at the end of it, if the panel votes for it, you receive the torture chamber. Now, what sort of methodology happened in the torture chamber? Well, let's be very specific because it's still torture, but let me be very specific about what's on the books here. The Spanish Inquisition used a handful of primary methods. First of all, there's the garrucha, which is sort of a pulley system. Your arms are tied behind your back, you're then hoisted up by the wrists, and you are dropped, and the shock of the stop dislocates your shoulders. There's the toca, which is a water torture. Linen straps would be shoved down your mouth and your throat, and then water is poured over it. Sort of code red meets waterboarding. Essentially, it feels like you're slowly drowning without actually quite dying. There is the potro, which is the rack, and the cords and tourniquets are wrapped around your limbs and you're stretched. And again, as I've said, one of the scarier parts about this is that these were actually formally written down as safeguards. A physician always had to be present, and a notary always had to be there to record everything that was said, every question, every answer, every cry, everything. Sessions were said to be limited. It was, again, considered to be merciful, and the panel had to vote to authorize it. This is on the books. This is repeatable, and this stays on the books for centuries. And obviously the big problem here is that there's a trap built into the structure itself. There's no way out of it. If you confess under torture and then take it back days later, if you say, oh, that was just because of the pain, the retraction is now treated as evidence and you're re-tortured. You can never take it back. You're broken and you'll stay broken. It's these sessions where you often get the most vivid and the most hard to read sections of the Spanish Inquisition. As a vivid story, one of the most famous is of Elvira del Campo. And her crime was that she ate pork and she changed her linen on Saturday. And the notary writes down all of her screams during the torture session. Loosen me and tell me what I have to say. I do not know what I have to say. They are tearing me to pieces. I have done all they say. Take it away. I am strangling. I am sick. Days of that, she eventually breaks down and confesses. And the written down confession itself is contradictory. It doesn't prove anything. Torture never does. All torture ever does is it measures your endurance. It doesn't measure the truth. So she is eventually executed herself. Now, how common was it to be put through torture and then eventually execution? Well, at the Toledo Tribunal between 1575 and 1610, roughly about a third of the prosecutions involved torture. So it's not everyone, but it's enough, and it's severe. And it is out of that structure of trial, exposure, some get let off, some get lesser punishments, and some eventually end up in the auto da fe, which is that they are marched out in a grand spectacle, especially in the city of Madrid, where this is most well known. The most famous one took place in 1680. It was just a giant parade. Over 1,000 familiares walk out in procession. It's easy to retell that story and make Spain and Catholicism look horrible in the process. But you have to realize this is the Spanish crown using faith to essentially impose fear and obligation on the community. By 1680, one of the grandest moments we're talking about, the very Jewish threat of the Conversos has long been gone, as I've already said. From 1391 to roughly 1491, let's give it a 100-year mark, the Jews have been decimated and amalgamated and assimilated into Spain. There was nothing left, and those that were left were kicked out. So the fact that this carries on is worth noting. Because as I've said, the Spanish Inquisition is a new thing, uniquely modern in some of its usage of religion and politics in this way of imposing order on people who, by the end, don't even fit the criterion of accusation. And this is what institutional terror actually looks like. It actually wasn't the bonfire and the big processionals and the blood and torture. It was the system underneath, where no one could justify their existence once you were caught up in the system. You couldn't meet your accusers. All the things we take for granted in modern legislation just wasn't used in this case. And in many ways, that's what makes the Spanish Inquisition so terrible to look at, is it's so cold-blooded. It's not a series of pogroms. It's a humming institution that is churning up and spitting out people left and right. And one of the ways that you have to reckon with the Spanish Inquisition is that you have to realize that it actually elevates some things out of the Middle Ages as well. And maybe the best way you can see this in the Spanish Inquisition is looking at what it actually cares about and how it operates, and you'll see that it is different. Start with torture. I just described some of the methods that were being employed. They're horrible, of course, but the Spanish Inquisition's torture practices were, by the standards of the time, less severe than those of the secular courts in the rest of Europe. Let me say that again. Though the Inquisition looks terrible to our modern ears, you have to understand that the actual courts and the prisons and the dungeons of most of Europe at this time follow the same or a worse pattern. Secular courts in France, in the Holy Roman Empire, in England, used hot irons, hot chairs, bone-breaking devices. They had unlimited duration. No physician was present, no notary. There was no time limit. What's interesting is Spain explicitly barred torture for lesser offenses. Blasphemy, bigamy, solicitation, none of those got you in the chamber. So it's this very odd thing where the Spanish Inquisition limits its torture, improves the torture, but does it so effectively it's more horrifying than just a tyrant noble somewhere in Europe that's doing these things by his own power. Another way that you can look at the Spanish Inquisition as being different is look at its position and its posture to witchcraft. The Spanish Inquisition cared nothing, and I do mean nothing, about witches. Between the 15th and the 18th centuries, Europe, everywhere not Spain, executes somewhere between 40 and 60,000 people for witchcraft. There's a total witch craze going through Germany, France, Scotland, a little bit in England, and the Netherlands. Entire districts are gutted. People, mostly women, are burned, hanged, drowned, all kinds of things. What's surprising is that in Spain, during the Inquisition, the one country that everyone claims is religiously hot-headed and crazy and engaged in all this religious persecution barely looks at witchcraft. During this entire period, Spain executes about a few hundred people for witchcraft. The rest of Europe, as I said, is around 40,000. Why? Because the Inquisition demanded evidence. Now, you might laugh at that claim, but compared to Europe, what the Inquisition was asking for was evidence. It was just circumstantial, hearsay, all the things we know in modern jurisprudence. But for that time, it was actually a step up. The credible evidence for witchcraft was not typically easy to find. Like, well, she turned me into a newt, but how do you prove that? Even as early as 1526, during the very hot times of the Spanish Inquisition, there was actually a meeting of the inquisitors and a bunch of theology experts, and they looked at this phenomenon of these claims about witchcraft going throughout Europe, and I kid you not, they eye-rolled. They found it silly and stupid and an evidentiary nightmare to try to prove that someone was a witch. And I'm not saying any of this so that you now have a warm place in your heart for the Spanish Inquisition. I just need you to understand what it actually is. The Spanish Inquisition is not medieval. The Spanish Inquisition is modern. It's a scary version of where modern politics and religion might go at times, but it's not some kind of throwback. And I think when people say that, they just want to pretend like it's a holdover, that it's not something legislated or cold or logical. The problem, though, and I think modern folks are more comfortable with realizing this, is that whenever you legislate something and you create a structure for it, you eventually can eat your own. And that is the Carranza case. And I'm going to tell you this story because it shows you what this machine could do at the height of power. Not to a converso, because again, it started out looking at conversos, these Jewish folks that are suspected of being secretly still Jewish. Eventually, as I said, you run out of folks that fit that bill, so you just keep carrying on. And in this case, the person that gets put in the crosshairs is the single most powerful churchman in Spain. And his name is Bartolome de Carranza. He is a Dominican. They show up a lot in the story. And he is a big theologian. In fact, he has international standing, known throughout Catholic Europe. He was a delegate to the Council of Trent, and he had a hand, he took a part in defining Catholic positions over against the Reformation. He was also the confessor to Philip II, who was the son of Charles V. Philip will eventually marry Tudor, create all kinds of issues in the Netherlands for Protestants. Very influential figure, Philip II. Well, Carranza is his confessor. And in 1557, he is raised to the Archbishopric of Toledo. That is a primatial see, and it is the richest archbishopric in Spain. Actually, the highest church office in the kingdom. So, by any measure, Carranza, you would think, is above reproach and not eligible to be subject to the scrutiny of the Inquisition. The problem, though, is that the Inquisitor General, Valdez, hates his guts. And so, Valdez is losing ground, losing favor with Philip, politically weakened, and then now Carranza is elevated to the Archbishopric of Toledo, and this is a personal humiliation. And so, eventually, a group of cells of Protestants are discovered in Valladolid around 1558, 1559, and Valdez sees his opening. Philip orders maximum severity, so Valdez deploys his weapon. He sends a theologian, Melchor Cano, also a Dominican and a very strong, kind of bitter academic who also hates Carranza, to go and comb through Carranza's published commentaries on the Catechism to see if he can dig up any dirt. Cano, surprisingly, finds 101 passages of heretical importance. So 1559, 40 horsemen surround Carranza's residence, the archbishopric no less, confessor to the king, delegate to Trent, highest churchman in Spain, and he is arrested and carried off to a secret prison in the Inquisition. He vanishes from public life. His trial doesn't get going until 1561, nearly 2 years being left in a secret prison. And when the accusations come, they're coming in waves. They're sort of successive rounds. And his defense is eventually crippled. Year after year, this case drags on. The greatest minds in Catholic theology weigh in on whether his writings are even heretical in the first place. And opinion actually is genuinely divided because the whole thing is politically charged. Eventually, it even becomes a war between the crown and the papacy. Pope Pius V eventually demands that the case be transferred to Rome. It is the Pope's prerogative, after all. Philip II refuses. Pius threatens to issue an interdict, which is to excommunicate the entirety of Spain. It's sort of the nuclear option. Philip still resists, and the case only eventually reached Rome years later. By that point, it's a new pope, Pope Gregory XIII, and he gives sort of a compromise document in 1571. He says that Carranza is vehemently suspect of heresy, but not a heretic himself. He must abjure 16 of his propositions and be suspended for 5 years. But at that point, it doesn't matter. 18 days after he is sentenced, Carranza dies. He entered prison at 56, and he dies at the age of 73. 17 years consumed by the very machine of the Inquisition. So I think when you see the Inquisition in that light, you realize that it's more than just a one-facet, one-factor movement. Did it have good things? Sure. It brought things like evidence and limited torture to the table, but it still had them on the table. And so much of what we consider to be its legislative practices would not even pass any court of law today. But it's not just simply also about the Jews, though it started out about the Jews. Here, a man who has no converso blood whatsoever is chewed up and spat out by the same Inquisition. The point is that the Inquisition is a far more complex thing than religious people do religiously stupid things. It's far more than just the medieval Catholic hiccup of the old days coming back to roost. It is a systematized, structural, strategic operation where crown, faith, and the inner life of people is weaponized so that your neighbors become permanently combative, permanently out to get you, and able to turn you in at a moment's notice. In the end, the Inquisition didn't die because it was defeated. It died in large part because it ran low on fuel. Eventually, the targets thinned themselves out. In the end, Spain had very few Jews left who had not either been intermarried or kicked out. Protestants never made more than a dent in Spain. But nevertheless, the Spanish Inquisition staggered on through the 18th century, chasing after Jansenists, Freemasons, go after people who like French philosophy, though on that last one I can understand. I probably sympathize with their desires. Finally, in 1808, when Napoleon invaded and took over Spain, he set up a French puppet regime, and the Inquisition made the catastrophic miscalculation of throwing in with that French puppet. Finally, whatever legitimacy it had drained away. Spain's revolutionary parliament, the Cortes de Cádiz, suppressed it on January 22nd, 1813. It got restored briefly, and eventually, the Inquisition is definitively abolished July 15th, 1834. Finally, the machine was turned off.